At my parents' anniversary dinner, my sister gave a toast thanking them for raising an only child. My mom raised her glass, my dad smiled, so I stood up and made an announcement that left everyone speechless. My name is Sadie Nolan, I'm 30 years old, and I thought $50,000 was the price of being seen. The envelope in my purse felt heavier than my laptop, heavier than a week's worth of groceries. It was thick with a cashier's check, the numbers printed in a severe, emotionless font. 50000, $50,000. 18 months of my life were folded into that crisp white paper. 18 months of ghostwriting dense tech manuals for companies that couldn't be bothered to make their own products understandable. Of editing college application essays for privileged kids who wrote about the profound life lessons they learned on a 2-week trip to Spain. I took every freelance writing gig I could find, working through weekends, fueling myself with cheap coffee until my hands shook and my vision blurred. I saw sunrises not because I was an early riser, but because I hadn't gone to bed yet. All of it for this one moment. I pictured my parents' faces when I handed it to them. Surprise first, then a slow dawning relief that would soften the hard lines around their mouths. And then, finally, maybe a flicker of gratitude so genuine it couldn't be faked. Maybe they'd finally see me not as the reliable, quiet daughter who just handled things, but as someone who could make a grand gesture, someone significant. The goal was simple, or so I'd told myself 1,000 times, to help them retire. Dad's contracting business had slowed down, and Mom's part-time job at the library was never going to be enough. This money was their bridge to a life without financial worry. It was a gift so significant they couldn't ignore it, or me. Driving to the restaurant, I rehearsed the little speech in my head. "For all you've done for us," I'd say, raising my glass. "A little something to help you start the next chapter." But the word "us" felt like a lie even in my own mind. It was a performance, a script I'd written for a play where I was the only one who didn't know my lines. I'd chosen their favorite restaurant, the Gilded Pear, a place so relentlessly beige and quiet it felt like a library where you were grudgingly allowed to eat. The carpets were thick, swallowing sound. The lighting was low, blurring faces. It was the kind of place where laughter felt like a disruption, perfect for them. The maitre d', a man whose smile was as starched as his shirt, looked right through me with polite disinterest until I mentioned the Nolan anniversary party. Then his professional smile clicked on like a fluorescent light. Of course, right this way, I was the first to arrive. Of course I was. It was my default setting in the family: show up early, pick up the slack, confirm the reservations, make sure the cake was ordered. I smoothed my dress and sat at the large, round table, the pristine white tablecloth a blank canvas for the evening's inevitable disappointments. A few minutes later, the door chimed and my Aunt Ruth and Uncle Gabe came in, their faces a welcome sight in the sea of muted tones. Their hugs were warm and real, not the stiff, pat-on-the-back gestures I was used to from my parents. They were the only ones who asked about my new project, not just if it paid well. Uncle Gabe, my uncle, looked at me, his gaze gentle but perceptive. "You've been working too hard, kiddo," he said, nodding at the dark circles under my eyes that my concealer couldn't quite hide. Aunt Ruth, my aunt, took my hand and squeezed it, her touch grounding. "We're so proud of you, Sadie." The words were so simple, so direct. Why did it feel like the first time I'd heard them in months? Then my sister Callie swept in, a full 20 minutes late, smelling of expensive perfume and sucking all the oxygen out of the room. She moved with an unearned confidence, as if the world was a stage built just for her. She kissed the air next to my cheek, a gesture of affection-adjacent performance. "Sadie, so glad you could make it," she said, her tone implying that my attendance was a pleasant surprise rather than the result of my own planning. As if I hadn't organized the entire event. My parents, Marjorie and Frank, arrived with her, flanking her like an honor guard. Dad clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was both familiar and completely empty, a muscle memory of fatherhood. Mom, meanwhile, was already fussing with Callie's hair, smoothing a strand that was already perfect. "You look beautiful, sweetie," she cooed. She hadn't even looked at my dress. The table was a sea of polite smiles and surface-level chatter. I felt like I was watching a television show about a family, not sitting with my own. The dinner was a performance and everyone played their part beautifully. Dad told a canned joke about marriage that he'd probably found on the internet and everyone laughed on cue. Mom recounted a story about Callie's childhood ballet recital, a story I'd heard at least 50 times, where Callie was the tiny, determined star and I was a blurry figure in the background if I was mentioned at all. I picked at my salmon, watching the white rectangle of the envelope peeking out of my purse, which sat on the empty chair beside me. It felt like a prop from a different play entirely, an object from a world of genuine emotion that had accidentally found its way onto this sterile set. Then Callie, my sister, stood up, tapping her water glass with a fork. The clinking sound was sharp and intrusive in the muted room, a call to attention. Everyone fell silent, turning their adoring gazes upon her. "I'd like to make a toast," she began, her voice full of a practiced emotion that she had perfected over years of being the center of attention. She talked about growing up, about the unwavering support she always received, about how Mom and Dad had always encouraged her to follow her dreams, no matter how impractical. She spoke of the sacrifices they'd made, painting a portrait of two heroic parents and their cherished offspring. My heart began to pound against my ribs, a frantic, hopeful drumbeat. This was it. The moment of unity, the moment where she would say us, and for once it would feel true. The moment that would make the 18 months of sleepless nights worth it. "Thank you," Callie said, her eyes glistening under the soft lights as she raised her champagne flute high. Her voice caught just enough to signal deep feeling. "For everything you did to raise your perfect, loving only child." A beat of silence followed her words. My fork, loaded with a piece of asparagus, stopped halfway to my plate. "Only child," the two words hung in the air, shimmering with malice. I slowly lowered my fork, the small sound of it touching the china plate seeming to echo in the sudden quiet of my mind. I looked at my parents. They were beaming at Callie, their faces glowing with pride. They lifted their own glasses, the champagne catching the light. They didn't even flinch. They didn't correct her. There was no awkward laugh, no "oh, Callie, you forgot your sister," nothing. They simply raised their glasses and drank to the daughter they saw. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. I knew that with a certainty that settled deep in my bones. It was a statement of fact, their fact. In the carefully curated story of their lives, I was a footnote, an extra in the background of a shot, easily edited out. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break. It clicked into place. A cold, quiet clarity washed over me, a feeling so sharp and clean it was almost peaceful. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was just done hoping for a scrap of recognition. Done trying to earn a love that was clearly not on offer. Done paying for a seat at a table where no one had ever saved me a plate. I watched them sip their champagne, their faces glowing in the soft, forgiving light of the gilded pair. They were a perfect family portrait, a masterpiece of denial with one person meticulously painted out, and I was tired of being the ghost in the machine. I stood up. My chair scraped against the polished floor, a harsh, ugly sound that tore through the quiet hum of the restaurant. Every head at the table and a few from the tables nearby turned towards me. For the first time all night, they were all looking at me. Their faces were a mixture of surprise, confusion, and from my father a flicker of irritation at the disruption. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The performance was over. I picked up my purse, the heavy envelope inside now feeling like a ballast, a weight that had kept me grounded in a false reality. I turned my back on them and walked away from the table. I didn't walk out of the restaurant. I walked across it. My heels made soft, deliberate sounds on the thick carpet. Every eye from my family's table followed me. I could feel the heat of their confusion, their unspoken questions radiating towards my back. Aunt Ruth and Uncle Gabe were sitting at a small table near the window, having been relegated to the edge of the main group, the designated B-list relatives. They had been watching the scene at our table, and Aunt Ruth's face was a canvas of concern. Uncle Gabe looked like he was ready to step in if things got ugly, his jaw set. He'd always been my quiet protector. I reached their table. I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't cry or scream or make a scene. The cold clarity from a moment ago was still with me, a shield of ice around my heart. I opened my purse, took out the thick white envelope that held 18 months of my life and placed it on the table in front of them. "This is for you," I said. My voice was even, steady. It didn't even sound like my own. Aunt Ruth looked from the envelope to my face, her brow furrowed. "Sadie, honey, what is this?" she asked, her voice gentle. "It's for the leaky roof," I said, my gaze meeting hers. "And the car that keeps breaking down, it's for the soup you drove 2 hours to bring me when I had the flu in college. It's for the guest room that was always ready when I had nowhere else to go. It's for seeing me." Uncle Gabe picked up the envelope. He felt the weight of it, the unusual thickness, and his eyebrows shot up. He started to open the unsealed flap, saw the cashier's check inside, and his eyes widened. "Sadie, we can't take this," he started, but his voice was thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place, shock, gratitude, maybe both. From across the room, I heard my father's voice, a low growl that I knew all too well. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He was half out of his chair, his napkin thrown on the table. My mother's hand was on his arm, her face pale with a mixture of shock and fury. The performance was over and the real emotions were finally showing. I didn't look at them. I kept my focus on the only 2 people in the room who mattered. "Please," I said to my aunt and uncle, my voice low but firm, "don't let them talk you out of it. You earned it." I leaned down and kissed them both on the cheek, then turned my back on my parents' table and walked out of the gilded pair without a single look back. The cold night air hit my face and it felt like a baptism. I had finally stopped waiting for them to see me. I had chosen who I would see. In my car, my hands didn't shake as I put the key in the ignition. I felt a profound, unnerving calm. The silence in the car was mine. It was finally, completely mine. My phone started ringing before I was even out of the restaurant parking lot. The name Dad flashed on the screen, illuminating the dark car. I pressed the button on the side of the phone, silencing the call and letting it go to voicemail. A moment later, it rang again. "Mom!" I ignored that one too. Then came the text from Callie, all capital letters, a digital scream. "What is wrong with you? You ruined everything." I put my phone on silent and placed it face down on the passenger seat, the screen dark. I didn't want their noise in my quiet. When I got home to my small apartment, the little red notification bubbles on my phone told the story. 7 missed calls and a string of increasingly frantic, angry texts. I ignored them all and went through the familiar ritual of making a cup of tea. The clink of the mug, the whistle of the kettle, the scent of chamomile, it was a small anchor in the storm I had just unleashed. Curiosity finally got the better of me. I picked up the phone and listened to one of the voicemails from my father. His voice wasn't concerned. It wasn't confused. It was furious, a low, controlled rage that was far more frightening than yelling. "You will call us back, Sadie," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You have publicly humiliated this family and you will fix this. That money was for us. It was a gift for our anniversary. You get it back from them." Now, the message was clear. It wasn't about the insult. It wasn't about my feelings. It was about the check. There was no apology for the only child comment, no question of why I might be upset enough to walk out. Their focus was singular, the money, not my pain, not the years of being erased, but the cash I had redirected. It confirmed everything I had felt in that cold, clarifying moment at the table. My value to them was conditional, transactional. I was a resource and I had just allocated myself elsewhere. The voicemail ended with a threat, thinly veiled as fatherly advice. "Don't make this uglier than it already is." I deleted the message. I took a deep breath and sent a single text message back to the family group chat, the one usually reserved for holiday planning and Callie's latest achievements. "The gift has been given to the people who deserve it. It is not up for discussion. I will not be answering calls tonight." Before they could respond, before the digital onslaught could begin anew, I blocked their numbers. Not permanently, not yet, but for the next 12 hours. I needed one night of peace, one night to let the new reality settle in. The quiet in my apartment was absolute. And for the first time in my entire life, it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like sovereignty. The next morning, the war went public, or at least as public as my sister could make it without looking like the aggressor. Callie's Instagram story was the first shot. It was a beautifully composed picture of a sunrise over a misty lake, the kind of generic, inspirational photo people post when they want to seem deep. Text was overlaid in a delicate, scripted font, so heartbroken when family chooses drama over love, praying for those who are struggling with their demons. There was no name, of course. There didn't have to be. It was aimed at me like a sniper's rifle, designed for an audience that only had her side of the story. A few hours later, a post appeared on her main feed, a smiling, sun-drenched photo of her and our parents from a vacation years ago. They looked like the perfect, happy family. The caption was a masterpiece of pious vagueness crafted to elicit maximum sympathy. Through thick and thin, we always have each other's backs. Family is forever, even when some people lose their way. So grateful for my amazing parents who taught me the meaning of unconditional love. The comments section immediately flooded with support from her friends and our extended family, people who had no idea what had actually transpired. Thinking of you, Cal, from my cousin Megan. So sorry you're going through this. Some people are just selfish and ungrateful, from one of her best friends. She was building a narrative brick by sanctimonious brick, and I was the villain in it. She was the devoted, long-suffering daughter, and I was the unstable, ungrateful mess who created drama for attention. My silence wasn't a dignified retreat in her carefully constructed story, it was a clear admission of guilt. Then the text messages started coming in from extended family members, the people Callie's posts had activated. They weren't angry, not directly, they were concerned. These were the flying monkeys sent to do the emotional bidding of my parents and sister. My cousin Megan wrote, "Hey, just saw Callie's post. Is everything okay? Mom said you caused a huge scene at the anniversary dinner." An old family friend, a woman who used to babysit us, sent a longer message. "Sadie, your mother is worried sick about you. She's hardly slept. Whatever this is about, maybe you should just call her and apologize to smooth things over. Life's too short for this kind of fighting." They were being used as messengers, dispatched to pressure me, to guilt me, to nudge me back into the familiar role of the compliant peacekeeper. Each message was a small poke, a test of my new boundaries. They all assumed, without question, that I was in the wrong. Why wouldn't they? My parents and Callie presented a united, reasonable front while I was silent. I refused to get into a texting war trying to explain the nuance of 30 years of emotional neglect in a tiny text bubble. My response to each one was polite but firm, a gray rock against their emotional tide. "Thank you for your concern. This is a private matter between me, my parents, and my sister. I'm not going to discuss it." This response was, of course, likely screenshotted and sent straight back to the family command center as proof of how cold and difficult I was being. I was an unfeeling monster who wouldn't even explain herself. The problem wasn't just my parents and my sister, it was the entire system they had built around them, an ecosystem that ran on my quiet compliance. And I had just cut off the supply. Aunt Ruth called, her voice strained. "Sadie, your mother called me 3 times this morning, and then your father called once." I closed my eyes, picturing my mother pacing in her beige living room, phone pressed to her ear. "What did she say?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "She said you're having some kind of breakdown," Ruth recounted, her tone dripping with disbelief, "that you're not well. She's worried you're being impulsive with money and that Gabe and I are taking advantage of your fragile state." My mother, the master manipulator, was weaponizing the language of mental health. "She asked me to do the right thing and give the money back before you do something else you'll regret." My attempt to stay above the fray, to handle this with quiet dignity, was failing spectacularly. My family was defining the narrative in the vacuum I'd left. My dignified silence was being expertly painted as mental instability. My generous gift to the only people who had consistently cared for me was being reframed as a symptom of my illness. Uncle Gabe got on the phone then. "We told her to get lost, Sadie, in nicer words, of course," he said, and I could hear the protective growl in his voice. "Don't you worry about us, but you need to understand they're not going to let this go." He was right. I realized I couldn't just ignore them. Ignoring them wasn't a strategy, it was an abdication. I couldn't win a public smear campaign, but I could refuse to be a character in their ongoing drama. I had to build a wall they couldn't get over, a boundary so clear it couldn't be misinterpreted. I spent the rest of the afternoon writing a letter, not an email they could forward and dissect, not a text they could screenshot out of context. A physical letter on good, thick paper. It was the calmest, most carefully worded document of my life. I wrote and rewrote each sentence, stripping out any emotion, any hint of anger or pain until only the cold, hard facts of my position remained. "Dear Mom, Dad, and Callie," it began. The events at the anniversary dinner were not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of feeling unseen and undervalued in this family. I didn't list grievances. I didn't rehash the only child comment or the thousands smaller cuts that had preceded it. That would be giving them ammunition. Instead, I focused on the future. "I am not mentally unwell," I wrote, my hand steady. "I am drawing a boundary. The gift to Ruth and Gabe is final and non-negotiable. Please respect their privacy and my decision." The next part was the most important. "For the sake of my own well-being, I will not be in contact for the foreseeable future. This includes calls, texts, emails, and unannounced visits. Please do not triangulate through other relatives. Do not send messages through them or put them in the middle of this. Any attempts to do so will not be answered." I ended it with a direct counter to their campaign. "The narrative you are creating about my mental health is false and deeply hurtful. It needs to stop." I signed it simply, Sadie. I put it in an envelope, addressed it, and walked to the post office. I paid extra for delivery confirmation. It wasn't an attack. It was a cease and desist delivered by the United States Postal Service. A week after I mailed the letter, the silence was unnerving. I had foolishly hoped it meant they'd backed off, that my formal written boundary had worked. I was wrong. They hadn't retreated, they had just regrouped and changed their angle of attack. Aunt Ruth called me. She sounded different than she had before, not just strained but deeply shaken. "Sadie," she said, her voice quiet and tight. "I received some messages on Facebook from an account with no picture and a fake name, just a generic silhouette and the name Jane Smith." My stomach instantly tightened into a cold, hard knot. "What did they say?" "It was screenshots," she said, and I heard her take a shaky breath. "Of text conversations that you had with a friend years ago about your family." She didn't have to tell me who the friend was, I knew. She described the screenshots, me venting to my old college roommate, Sarah, after a particularly bad holiday visit 5 years prior. I had just gotten my own apartment, and the visit had been a brutal reminder of why I'd been so desperate to leave home. I had written things like, "Sometimes I feel like I'm just an ATM and a free therapist to them, and it's like I don't even exist unless they need something." Another one said, "Callie gets everything handed to her on a silver platter, and I have to fight for every scrap." They were private vents between best friends, the raw, frustrated words of someone at the end of her rope. They weren't vicious, but stripped of all context and presented to my aunt, they were ugly. The anonymous account had sent them with a simple, poisonous message: "This is who you're defending." A hateful, jealous girl. How would anyone even get those? I asked, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the violation, and then it hit me with the force of a physical blow. 2 years ago, Callie had borrowed my old laptop. My new one had just arrived, and I was in the process of transferring files. She'd claimed her own was on the fritz and she needed to get some photos off an old hard drive. I, being the ever-helpful sister, had said yes. She must have gone through my entire message history, found the most damaging conversations, and taken screenshots. She had been sitting on this ammunition for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to use it. The phrasing of the anonymous message was the final damning clue. A hateful, jealous girl. Those were my mother's exact words. She'd screamed them at me during an argument when I was a teenager, after I dared to be upset that Callie got a brand new car for her 16th birthday while I was saving up from my part-time job at a grocery store to buy a 15-year-old junker. Callie had taken the screenshots. Mom had dictated the message. It was a coordinated, premeditated attack. This wasn't just a smear campaign anymore. This was a profound violation. They had gone through my private conversations, saved them for years like a secret weapon, and deployed them with surgical precision to hurt the only family I had left. It was proof. Hard, undeniable proof that this wasn't about concern for my well-being. It was about punishment. It was about control. It was designed to do one thing, to isolate me from Ruth and Gabe, to poison that well and leave me with absolutely no one. They wanted to make my aunt and uncle doubt me, to see me as the monster my family had always painted me to be. It was the cruelest thing they had ever done, and the competition for that title was fierce. Aunt Ruth was quiet on the other end of the phone for a long moment. I held my breath, waiting for the verdict, waiting for the doubt to creep into her voice. Instead, she said, her voice firm and clear, "They're trying to make us think you're the monster. But Sadie, all this proves is what kind of people they are." Her validation was like a deep breath of clean air in a suffocating room. They had tried to poison my last well of support, and the poison hadn't worked. This reveal burned the last rickety bridge of hope I might have secretly harbored for reconciliation. There was no misunderstanding this. There was no going back from this. I was no longer just defending a boundary. I was fighting an active, malicious campaign waged by my own family. The ticking clock wasn't just social anymore. If they were willing to do this, to dig up years-old conversations and use them as weapons, what else were they willing to do? My freelance career was my entire life. It depended on my reputation, on my professionalism, on my reliability. My name was my business. The thought that they might try to sabotage my work, which had seemed paranoid just a week ago, now felt like a terrifyingly logical next step. I realized I couldn't just keep playing defense, reacting to their attacks. I needed to get ahead of this. I immediately called Sarah, my old roommate, and told her what had happened. She was horrified and furious on my behalf. "Sadie, that's disgusting. I'm so sorry. Anything you need, a statement, anything, just ask." Her unwavering support was another small brick in the new foundation I was trying to build. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. It was about my survival. My biggest and most important client was a man named Daniel Hart. He ran a boutique marketing firm, and I was his go-to writer for high-stakes projects. He paid well, he paid on time, and he respected my work. I had a major $18,000 project on my plate for him right now, a series of articles and web copy that would make up most of my income for the next 3 months. The thought of my family interfering with that relationship made me feel sick. I decided to make a preemptive move, a subtle one. I spent an hour that evening polishing my professional presence. I updated my LinkedIn profile, adding recent testimonials, including a glowing one from Daniel about my professionalism and reliability under pressure. I went through my personal social media accounts, archiving any old posts that felt too personal or vulnerable, and tightening my privacy settings on everything to be visible to friends only. I was building a digital fortress. Then I opened my laptop and created a new, separate folder on my computer. I named it Documentation. I saved the screenshots Ruth had forwarded me from the fake Facebook account. I saved the delivery confirmation for the letter I had mailed. I was no longer just a hurt daughter trying to protect her peace. I was a professional protecting her assets from a hostile party. This was a forced pivot, a transformation born of necessity. I was done reacting to their moves. It was time to anticipate them. The fear was still there, a cold pit in my stomach, but now it was mixed with a cold, hard resolve. They had shown me exactly who they were. It was time I believed them. The email landed in my inbox on a Tuesday morning. The subject line was innocuous, checking in. The sender was Daniel Hart. My heart sank before I even opened it. Daniel was a man of action, of bullet points and deadlines. Checking in was not his usual style, it was corporate code for "there's a problem." I clicked it open, and the polite, professional words on the screen felt like a punch to the gut. "Sadie," it read, "hope you're having a productive week. I'm writing because I received a rather unusual email last night regarding your personal circumstances. It came from a family member expressing concern for your well-being and your ability to handle your current workload." It was happening. The thing I had feared most, the professional sabotage, was no longer a paranoid fantasy. It was here, in my inbox. "Given the nature of the email and the importance of the upcoming project deadline," he continued, "I think it's best we put a temporary pause on the project. I don't want to add to your plate if you're dealing with a difficult situation." He was trying to be kind, I knew, but the effect was devastating. "Let's touch base in a week or so. I hope everything is all right." An $18,000 project, my income for the next 3 months, paused indefinitely. The email they must have sent him was surely a work of art, a carefully crafted fiction painting me as unstable, unreliable, a professional risk. They had used the language of corporate concern to mask a deeply personal vendetta. The floor felt like it had dropped out from under me. This was no longer just about hurt feelings or social media posts. This was a direct, calculated attack on my livelihood. My first instinct was pure animal panic. I could call Daniel, apologize profusely, and explain it all away as a terrible family misunderstanding. I could grovel. I could call my parents, beg them, promise to get the money back from Ruth and Gabe if they would just retract the email and leave my career alone. The old Sadie would have done that in a heartbeat. She would have smoothed it over, taken the blame, done whatever it took to restore the peace, no matter the cost to her own dignity. But the old Sadie was gone. She'd walked out of that beige restaurant and never come back. To give in now, to surrender to their blackmail, would be to admit that they were right. It would validate their tactics. It would mean that every sleepless night, every ounce of anxiety, every painful step I had taken over the last 2 weeks had been for nothing. This was the moment of truth. Was my integrity, my newfound self-respect, worth $18,000? The choice was irreversible. If I held my ground, I might lose my best client, my income, and my reputation. Daniel might decide I was too much trouble and find another writer. If I caved, I would lose myself. I would be proving to them and to myself that I could be broken, that their control over me was absolute. I looked at the documentation folder on my desktop. I looked at the memory of my parents' smiling, oblivious faces as they toasted their only child. And I made my choice. I would not call them. I would not beg. I would not surrender. This was my line in the sand. I sat down and wrote a reply to Daniel. It wasn't long. I didn't beg. I didn't unravel into a confession. I typed one clean paragraph, the kind of message my old editors would have approved. Precise, unemotional, factual. "Daniel," I wrote, "thank you for the heads up. My family has chosen to weaponize my personal life to put pressure on me financially after I redirected a personal gift to relatives who supported me when my parents did not. Their claims about my stability are unfounded. I'm managing the situation and remain fully capable of delivering the work on schedule. Please let me know how you'd like to proceed." I hit send before I could worry over the phrasing or soften it. That single line was my armor. When the email left my outbox, something loosened in me. It wasn't victory, it was acceptance. I realized my goal had to change. Before all of this, the aim had been smaller, to be acknowledged, to be seen. Now the stakes were different. I wanted more than validation from Mom and Dad. I wanted a life they couldn't touch with their narratives, a life built so deliberately and plainly that their gossip would look absurd beside facts. I wanted clients who hired me for my work not because they felt sorry for me. I wanted friends who knew me for the person I was, not the character they wrote about me. I wanted financial resilience that wasn't dependent on their approval. Winning, then, wasn't revenge in the theatrical sense. It wasn't revenge that screamed. It was becoming a person whose existence made their lies irrelevant. It was paying my rent without frantically checking my inbox for a hostile email. It was accepting that the cost might be losing them forever and deciding that was an acceptable price for my dignity. I braced for fallout. If they tried to cut me off at work, I would lean into every small freelance job. If they painted me as unstable, I'd build a schedule and invoices that told a different story. If they turned the town against me, I'd make a new town of people who actually knew me. The plan felt audacious because it required me to believe in myself more than I'd believed in anything else. But it was honest, and at that moment honesty felt like power. A few days later, Uncle Gabe called on a Saturday with a voice I'd never heard from him before, tight, tired. "They're here, Sadie," he said without preface. My stomach hollowed out. "Who's here?" I asked. He told me Mom and Dad had driven the hour and a half to their house and shown up while Ruth was making coffee. I'd expected emails and pokes. I hadn't expected them to cross the county line like storm clouds. Gabriel's way of describing the scene made my skin crawl. "They're not yelling," he said, "they're performing. Mom's crying, she's got tissues, and Dad's using that reasonable man tone, telling Ruth how worried they are about you." They walked through the kitchen like they were on stage, talking about helping and looking after family. He told me what they were saying, how I had been unstable and had forced my money on Ruth and him as if I'd been tricked by some impulse. He suggested, gently and with that usual Gabe patience, that the right thing would be to return the money to them for safekeeping. The words landed like a hand on my throat. This wasn't merely about dollars anymore. It was a pressure tactic meant to humiliate Ruth and make her doubt her own judgment. My aunt and uncle had always been practical, good-hearted people. The idea of them being cornered into doing something against their will filled me with a protective fury I hadn't felt since I was a kid and someone picked on my bike. "Ruth is holding her own," Gabe assured me, "but your mother, she's following her from room to room, Sadie, talking about what a good mother she is and how she just wants her daughter back." I could picture it. Mom gliding around the living room with tissues, playing the concerned matriarch, while Dad looked on with that smug half-smile that always meant he thought he was right. I felt a hot, useless anger at my own hands for having brought this into their lives. "I'm coming over," I said before I thought it through. I wanted to stomp up their porch, set my parents straight, make them leave. "Don't," Gabe cut in, quietly but firmly. "That's exactly what they want. They want a scene. They want you to show up so they can take a picture and post it like you're dramatic or aggressive. Stay where you are. We can handle them." He sounded tired in a way that made me feel like I'd failed him by even thinking of coming. He asked about specifics, and I told him to tell them nothing, to offer nothing that could be twisted. Gabe promised they would keep the front door locked and that he would call me if anything escalated. I wanted to argue, to say that presence mattered more than optics, but I knew he was right. My parents were playing a long game of theater. My entrance would only supply them with a new scene. Hearing Gabe's voice, calm but strained, pushed me into a small, frantic list of steps. Double-check the documentation saved in my documentation folder, text Sarah to be on standby, make sure Ruth had an emergency number list. I also made a decision that felt both cowardly and strategic. I wouldn't drive over. Part of me hated that. Part of me knew that if I showed up, they'd film it, they'd frame it, they'd exploit my anger for pity. That was what they'd always done. So I made mugs of tea over and over, pacing my apartment like a caged animal and waiting for a call. 2 hours later, when Gabe called back, his voice had softened. "They're gone," he said. "Mom tried to follow Ruth to the attic and started sniffing around her things. I asked her to leave and she did, but she kept calling on the drive home." "They're not done, Sadie. This is just the start." Even through the phone, the apology in his voice was obvious. My sanctuary, the one place I knew I was always welcome, had been invaded. Ruth's warm kitchen, where I had once healed from a broken heart with chicken soup and quiet companionship, had been turned into a stage for Mom and Dad's performance. I felt exposed in a way the Instagram posts couldn't reach. The only house I trusted had been used as a backdrop for my parents' manipulation. That afternoon, the public exposure turned ugly in a way I hadn't anticipated. A woman from a Facebook community group for our town, someone who traded plants and recommended electricians, tagged me under a post my mom had made. It was the kind of online place where people asked for recipes and posted lost dog notices, and there, plastered across the top, was a message from Mom. "Has anyone seen my daughter Sadie? Please call, very worried, we haven't been able to reach her." The post was accompanied by a photo of Mom and Dad at their porch looking intentionally pained. It read like a missing person alert written with all the emotional manipulation of a Hallmark card. I felt the color drain from my face. People I hadn't spoken to in years commented. The high school cross-country coach wrote, "Hope everything's okay, sending prayers." The owner of the bakery where I used to buy scones said, "If you need anything, contact your family." The message wasn't neutral. It insinuated I was unreachable because I was unstable, because I was out of my mind. A woman from my yoga class tagged me with a concerned emoji. Someone else suggested I might be in danger. For the first time since this started, my private life was not limited to family inboxes. My personal hardship had been turned into civic theater. The post spread faster than I'd expected. I had always been careful about oversharing, but this felt like being stripped of privacy in front of my literal neighbors. The comment thread filled with speculation and sympathy, and each "hope she's okay" felt like a drop of salt into an open wound. It was humiliating, it was invasive. It was exactly the kind of social pressure my parents had been counting on, neighbors whispering, acquaintances offering condolences, a community that began to see me as a fragile, unreliable person. They were trying to make my entire town into an audience that would shame me into retreating. I wanted to write back, to post the truth, short, factual, that I'd given a gift to my aunt and uncle, that I was fine, and that my family was using the town to pressure me. But the thought of replying in that thread made my skin crawl. It would be petty, and Mom would screenshot it and use my words against me. Instead, I took a breath and did something small and practical. I messaged Gabe and Ruth, asking them to take screenshots of everything Mom posted and to save it. "We need a record," I wrote. "If they keep this up, we can show patterns." It felt ridiculous to talk about documentation and evidence when my mother had just posted a plea like a production, but it was the thing that kept me from spiraling. The truth could wait. For now, I had to protect myself and the people who had protected me. The financial pressure kept tightening like a hand around my throat. Daniel still hadn't replied to my brief, honest email. The pause on the project stretched into a silence that felt louder than any accusation. Every time my inbox refreshed, my chest tightened a little more, like someone was slowly turning a valve. My savings account looked smaller every time I logged in. I had drained most of the cushion to give the $50,000. I had thought I'd be trading money for recognition. Instead, I'd traded a safety net for a stand. I started taking anything that would pay by the week: blog posts about mattress toppers, tiny product descriptions for kitchen gadgets, copy for a local dentist's new website. The work itself felt like chewing cardboard. My hands learned to type faster and with less feeling. The small jobs kept the lights on and the landlord paid, but they didn't soothe the rawness of what was happening at home. The irony was a cold joke I couldn't stop hearing. The money I had saved to make my parents comfortable had disappeared into a fight that left me scrambling for groceries. I kept thinking about how weird it was that the very thing meant to buy them dignity had become the instrument of my own instability in their eyes. Every ping on my phone was a small electric shock. A new client inquiry, a promotional email, an automated reminder about an unpaid subscription. Or worse, a forwarded message from someone in my parents' orbit, full of concern and never a shred of curiosity about the facts. I found myself checking the locked folder on my desktop more than I checked the news. Documentation had become as comforting as a blanket. Proof was less warm than I expected, but it had weight. It kept me from doing anything rash. It kept me from calling Mom or Dad and begging them to stop. At night, the apartment felt claustrophobic. The lamp over my desk cast a small pool of light, and outside the window the street was quiet. I made lists of small wins, emails sent, invoices paid, a new brief completed. It was a lifeline, not dramatic, not fast, but steady. If they wanted to ruin me, they had to outwork me. If they wanted to call me unreliable, I would show up punctually and with polished drafts. But underneath every deadline, there was the same ache, the knowledge that they had the capacity to hurt the people who had actually saved me, Ruth and Gabe, and that realization stung worse than anything they could post online. Then Ruth called. Her voice was different, quiet, but something sharp under it, like the scrape of a chair leg across a wooden floor. She told me that Mom had said something that didn't sit right during the visit. In the middle of her performance of worry, Mom had claimed, "We've always given Sadie every advantage, just like we did for Callie. We've always been fair." It was the kind of sentence meant to close a case, to tidy up contradictions into a neat lie. Ruth said the line had hung in the air so oddly that it made her go do something she hadn't planned on. She climbed into the attic. I could hear the dust in her voice when she told me. The attic had that smell you remember from childhood. Old paper, cedar chests, the ghosts of garments. I was just looking for a box of baking tins, she told me, and instead I found a shoebox with our names on it. She laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. It was like finding a time capsule. She said she'd sat on the attic floor with the lid off for half the morning, reading letters and notes. There was a quiet in her telling, like she was holding something too fragile to place down. "Sadie," Ruth said slowly, "I think you should hear this." She read to me from the letter she pulled from the shoebox. The paper was thin with age and smelled faintly of lavender and smoke, the way my grandmother's handkerchiefs used to smell. Ruth's voice softened as she read words that were almost too direct to be true. "My dearest Ruth," she began, and then read what felt like an instruction from the past. "I am so glad we had our talk. I worry about the girls. Frank and Marjorie are so much harder on Sadie. They see a spark in Callie and a tool in Sadie. That is not fair. That is not right. I have made arrangements to make sure both girls have a small start at adulthood. I have purchased $24,000 in savings bonds, $12,000 for each girl to be given to them on their 18th birthdays. I have placed them in Frank's safe deposit box, and he has promised to keep them safe for me." Hearing my grandmother's handwriting across the years felt like someone had opened a window in a sealed room. The words were simple and private, not meant to be a verdict but a protection. She had seen a pattern and tried to correct it in the smallest, clearest way she could. The image of Grandma Evelyn, discreet and deliberate, buying bonds and whispering instructions to Ruth, stuck in my head like a photograph. I had imagined her as sentimental and gentle, but these were deliberate acts of care, real plans with numbers attached. The idea that Grandma Evelyn had tried to give me $12,000 and that it had been handed off without my knowledge felt like a betrayal that had been slow-cooked for years. Ruth paused, and there was a breath between us. "There was more," she said. I heard her shuffle papers as she spoke. She had found not only the letter but a bank slip tucked in the box, 10 years old, creased at the fold, stamped with a small bank logo. It showed a redemption of savings bonds a couple of weeks after my 18th birthday. The amount matched what Grandma had described. The date was precise. The signature on the slip was unmistakable, Dad's name. Ruth read the details slowly, as if making sure each one landed correctly in my ears. "It looks like someone cashed them," she said. "And the timing is, well, the timing is after your birthday." And there was a note about Callie's summer program. The cold, small theft of that moment cut through me. It wasn't a clever crime. It was not a ledger of complicated accounts. It was a simple bank slip and a signature, and those things were undeniable in their plainness. My grandmother had planned $12,000 for me. My parents had signed a document that showed the money had been taken. Ruth said her hands shook when she found it, and I pictured her on that attic floor, dust on her knees, feeling the world she'd known tilt. I could hear her holding back anger, not at me, but at the way my life had been quietly rearranged without my consent. The discovery made everything click into place with a painful clarity. The way they never celebrated my small wins, the way they saved praise for Callie, the way gifts and opportunities always seemed to favor her. Suddenly it wasn't just cruelty or poor parenting. It was a pattern of redirecting resources away from me. The $50,000 I had given Ruth and Gabe no longer felt like a naive attempt to buy their attention. It felt like a correction, deliberate or not, toward a balance that had been stolen long ago. The shoebox, the letter, the bank slip, they were small, everyday objects, but together they were a map of how my life had been steered. I felt hollow and vindicated at the same time. Ruth's voice steadied as she spoke of the bank slip specifics. She told me the total amount, the dates, and that Dad's signature was clear. "This isn't speculation, Sadie," she said quietly. "This is a paper trail." The simplicity of that fact made my head swim. For years I'd been told I was sensitive, dramatic, prone to misreading kindness. Now I had a dead woman's handwriting and an old bank record that said otherwise. The theft wasn't poetic, it was ordinary. It had been done with a checkbook and a signature, and that ordinariness made it worse. It was easier to live with the idea of a dramatic betrayal than with the idea that someone had quietly cashed a future meant for me and spent it on decorating Callie's world. When Ruth finished telling me everything she had found, there was a long silence on the line. I pressed the phone to my ear like a talisman, feeling the weight of proof and the weight of what it meant. My plan had to change. The stakes were no longer theoretical. My parents hadn't just painted me out of family photos and conversations, they had taken money that was legally and morally designated for me. I could feel the options narrowing. Apologize and give in, which would validate their method, or use what I'd been given to build something real that would make their narrative irrelevant. The cold, practical part of me, the part that had learned to hustle for crumbs and stretch contracts, kicked in. There was a next step, and it would start with Ruth scanning and sending me everything. Then I would do what I had to do to protect my work, my name, and my future. When Ruth finished telling me everything she had found, the quiet between us felt like the moment before a glass breaks. There was no dramatic reveal anymore, no twist of fate, just the slow, ordinary fact of what had happened. My parents hadn't just favored Callie, they'd taken something that belonged to me, something my grandmother had planned for me in secret. That small, steady theft changed the rules. The last little hope I had that maybe this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that maybe they'd been thoughtless but not malicious, evaporated. There was no longer room for any soft answers. That tiny, private hope, the one that let me imagine Mom and Dad as flawed but basically decent, was gone. In its place was a new, sharper understanding. They had the habit of redirecting resources away from me, and they'd done it with intention, or at least with complacent cruelty. The world I'd lived in my whole life, where I kept showing up and fixing what they broke, suddenly felt less like family and more like a system designed to keep me small. I had to accept that reconciliation wasn't an option unless it came with acknowledgement and change, and I couldn't count on that. My options were narrowing, and the clock was loud in my ears. The urgency of money, always a practical concern, now had moral weight. The $18,000 project with Daniel wasn't just pay, it was leverage, a way I could keep breathing. My savings, already depleted by the $50,000, looked pathetic and fragile. Rent was a drumbeat in the back of my head. If I apologized and folded now, I would hand them a win. They would have proved their power. If I held firm, I risked losing everything. Neither choice felt safe, but one choice felt honest. Holding my ground had become an act of survival and, in a way, justice. Ruth promised to scan and email every scrap she'd found. The image of her sitting in the dust of an attic, sorting through a shoebox of other people's memories, felt like a weight and also a key. If I had proof, maybe I could stop their stories from swallowing truth. It wasn't an elegant plan. It was the only plan left: document, defend, and keep working. The last safe option, the belief that maybe they meant well and just made mistakes, was gone. There was only forward, or the slow unraveling of everything I'd built. I chose forward. When the files arrived in my inbox, they sat there like small, heavy stones. a scanned letter with my grandmother's looping handwriting and a bank slip with a date and my dad's signature. I stared at them until the letters blurred, then sat back and felt the odd mix of relief and dread that comes with knowing something terrible is true. Relief, because proof finally matched the suspicion that had lived in the bottom of my chest for years. Dread, because evidence makes things actionable and actions have consequences. This should have felt like a victory, instead it felt like an anchor tied to my ankle. Holding the truth didn't undo the years of being unseen. It didn't fix the nights I ate cereal in front of a television while Mom and Dad cheered at Callie's recitals. It made the betrayal more concrete, less like a mood and more like a crime. I had to think about who would believe me. If I showed the documents to Mom and Dad, they'd probably deny them. They'd call the handwriting fake or say Grandma was confused in her later years. If I posted them online, I'd look like I was trying to ruin the family. The small, sturdy truth of the paper felt vulnerable and raw against the huge, practiced narrative my parents had built. I sat with the files open and realized that proof was not a magic wand. It was a tool, but tools need a plan. I could wave the letters and shout until my voice broke, or I could use them in a way that mattered to the people who could help me keep my life together. Daniel was the only person whose opinion had real impact on my immediate future. If he believed me, it might mean the difference between keeping my project and losing everything. If he didn't, then I would have to start rebuilding from scrounging work and overnight shifts of low-paying copy, and the weight of the proof would be useless vanity. The silence from Daniel felt like a verdict. My inbox had been my midday ritual, but now every refresh was a small lurch of panic. I had enough for next month's rent maybe, but not much else. The money I'd funneled into helping my parents now looked like a cruel trade. I'd bought them comfort, and in return they attacked my stability. Messages from extended family had trickled to a stop. My firm boundaries had made me a non-entity to them. That quiet was its own kind of isolation. There were no more flying monkeys, there was only the heavy stillness of being outcast. The solitude was deeper than the empty apartment could explain. It felt like standing outside a warm house watching a family dinner through fogged glass. I remembered how small I used to feel, the kid who ate in the kitchen while Mom and Dad applauded Callie in the living room. Now the scene was flipped. I had walked away, but the ache of not belonging was the same. Ruth and Gabe were my only real anchors, and even they were under pressure because of my choice. The core wound, this feeling that I was not meant to be seen, opened up in the quiet, and the old urge to fold, to apologize, to make things easier, whispered like a bad habit. At my lowest point, I almost gave in. I pictured packing up, moving to a new city, changing my name, starting over somewhere where no one knew me. It was a fantasy of erasure that felt both tempting and cowardly. But then I reread the email I had written to Daniel, the calm, factual note that didn't beg for mercy. I thought of Grandma Evelyn's handwriting, the way she had quietly tried to set things right. They see a spark in Callie and a tool in Sadie. The word tool lodged in my throat. I had been useful to them in ways that never involved love. Tools don't have voices, but I did. It occurred to me, slow and frightening, that I hadn't tried one clear, blunt thing. I could tell Daniel the truth, not in a dramatic, messy way, but as facts laid out plainly. He respected facts. He respected evidence. If I showed him the letter and the bank slip, maybe he'd see the pattern for what it was. Not a family quarrel, but a coordinated attempt to pressure and control me. It was unorthodox and risky, the kind of personal detail clients rarely wanted. It might backfire and burn bridges with other potential clients too, but it was the one move I hadn't made. I could keep taking low-paid gigs until I sank, or I could stake everything on the truth and hope a reasonable person would respond to it. I sat down and started composing the final email. My hands were steadier than I felt. I attached the scans, the letter with Grandma Evelyn's looping script and the bank slip with the unmistakable signature. I kept the subject line plain, follow-up regarding project pause. The paragraph itself was short, professional, and without drama. Daniel, I wrote, further to my last email, I've attached 2 documents for context. They show a documented history of financial misappropriation by my family, which is the root of the current conflict. The concern they express to you is a tactic to apply financial pressure on me after I redirected a significant personal gift away from them. I added one final sentence to make my case clear and to set expectations. This is the last I will say on the matter. My ability to deliver the high-quality work you expect remains my top priority. I hope we can resume our partnership. I didn't apologize, I didn't beg. I didn't sprinkle in the emotional details that would make it feel like drama. The paragraph was a business memo more than a confession. I hit send and watched the little spinning wheel turn into a confirmation that the email had gone. Then I closed my laptop and sat very still. The sound of my own breathing seemed loud in the small room. The choice was out of my hands. All I could do now was wait and keep working and try not to imagine the worst while still bracing for it. Less than an hour after I hit send, my phone buzzed. I remember the sound, short, polite, and the way my chest tightened at the sight of Daniel Hart in my inbox. I didn't let myself hope. I opened it with the same careful calm I'd used to compose my message, like opening a mailbox you haven't checked in a storm. Sadie, it read, thank you for the clarification. This is unacceptable behavior on their part. Project is back on, effective immediately. Let's schedule a call for tomorrow morning to discuss next steps. I read it 3 times, like tasting something foreign, until it became familiar. The relief hit me like a physical thing, the way you feel when a hand comes out of nowhere and steadies you on a train platform. It wasn't fireworks or vindication footage on television. It was a 1-line email that said the professional facts mattered. That was all I needed. Daniel didn't demand explanations or interrogate my personal life. He looked at the evidence and decided it was enough. I let myself breathe. For the first time in weeks, my tight, urgent panic loosened. I made a small, ridiculous list of things: buy stamps, call Ruth back, reschedule the dentist appointment I'd been postponing. I sent a short reply, thank you, Daniel. I'll be on the call, I appreciate your quick response. Then I shut the laptop and walked around my apartment, touching surfaces like a person who had been underwater and found land. Relief is strange, it doesn't erase the hurt. It just shows you can keep going in spite of it. Still, I felt seen in a way no family meeting had ever allowed. A stranger had believed the plain facts and held up a light. That alone made the risk of telling him worth it. I slept better that night than I had in months. For the first time, the future felt salvageable, not just precarious. The next morning, I drove to the old neighborhood. I had no appetite for theatrics. I wasn't going to knock or confront. I didn't want to shout or beg or hand them a story they could twist. I wanted the truth to be a simple, undeniable thing they couldn't unwrite. I printed copies of my grandmother's letter and the bank slip, slid them into a plain manila envelope, and walked up the cracked concrete path we all knew too well. The house looked smaller from the outside, the paint a little flakier, the hydrangeas overgrown. I stood on the step and felt something that was almost peaceful. There was no rage bubbling up, no need to perform for the neighbors. I slid the envelope through the mail slot. The sound of it hitting the floor inside felt absurdly loud, a single thud that carried all the things I'd been holding for years. I did not ring the bell. I did not look back. Walking away, I imagined them finding the paper, the ink of a dead woman's handwriting saying what had been true all along. I pictured Dad's furrowed brow and Mom's practiced explanations. I wanted them to live with the evidence, to have to answer it even if only to themselves. I didn't want the satisfaction of their discomfort. I wanted the quiet efficacy of truth left where it could do its work. I wanted to stop performing sorrow or begging for recognition. That envelope was the last line of a conversation I wasn't going to have. Back at my apartment, the ritual came naturally. I pulled up Callie's Instagram and saw the curated photos, the tags, the pious captions. It would have been easy to post something explosive, to fling the facts into the comments, to make a scene that would satisfy online audiences and probably terrify Ruth. But 2 weeks of being weaponized had taught me something important. Spectacle feeds them, facts corner them. I muted Callie's account and then blocked it. I blocked Mom and Dad. I took a deep breath and let the digital curtains fall. Then I called Ruth. Her voice on the line was like a warm blanket and a fist at the same time, relief wrapped around simmering anger. "Daniel's back on board," I told her, and I could hear her exhale. "The project will proceed. I'm going to let them fix the roof. Please don't let them feel guilty about it." "Sadie," she said, her voice thick, "Gabe and I have been talking. We'll get the roof done and set the rest aside like you said. No strings." She sounded steadier than she'd been in weeks. I told her exactly what I wanted: the roof, a little emergency fund, and no lectures. "Use what will make you sleep better, Ruth. Keep the receipts. This is for you, not for an explanation." We laughed a little, the way people laugh after a storm, and the sound felt like oxygen. After I hung up, I took inventory. I deleted Mom's number. I deleted Dad's. I removed Callie from my contacts and from my life with the same quiet method I'd used to remove a splinter: firm, direct, necessary. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. I thought of the years I'd spent smoothing edges and said goodbye to that tired, small self. Blocking them felt final in a way that also felt freeing. The space I'd given away for recognition was now mine to refill with people who saw me without conditions. That night, 6 months later, I sat at a table that smelled of garlic and roast chicken, not beige butter and forced smiles. The oak table at Ruth and Gabe's house looked older, kinder. The tablecloth was a cheerful mismatch, and the glasses didn't clink like a performance. They clinked because Gabe had just made a joke that landed. There was no fanfare, no speech, just the soft domestic hum of people who liked each other and had chosen each other. Gabe raised his glass of iced tea and said to Sadie, his eyes crinkling the way they always did when he meant it. Ruth echoed it and laughed, a full, easy sound that reached my ribs. We were celebrating a roof. It was such a small thing in some ways and such a huge thing in others. The cost had been steep. I had lost my parents and my sister. Friends and acquaintances had drifted, unsure of which story to believe. But around this table, the metrics for worth weren't applause or performance. They were the little practicalities: a dry ceiling, a steady check-in call, movie nights in sweatpants. I thought of that beige restaurant and how hollow it had felt, how every laugh there seemed edited. Here, the silence felt comfortable. We could be messy and real. Ruth told a story about a neighbor's dog, and we all laughed until tea came out our noses. The intimacy was simple and unshowy. It was a reminder that the cleanest revenge isn't spectacle. It's building a life that renders the old wounds irrelevant. I heard, some weeks later through cousin Megan, that Mom and Dad had their own narrative now. They were telling people I had been unstable, manipulated by greedy relatives who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable daughter. The thought stung at first. Old habits want us to seek permission from the world, to let other people's stories decide our worth. But now those stories slid off me like water. I had a roof, a table, and 2 people who had never used me to feed their story. Their lies couldn't reach the little life we'd made. If you ever find yourself choosing between the people you were born into and the people who actually show up, know this: you get to choose. Family isn't only who shares your blood. It's who brings you soup when you're sick, who lets you cry without turning it into a lesson, who sits with you in the quiet. If this story landed with you, share it in the comments. Tell me who you chose and why. If you like this kind of story, subscribe for more. We've got another one queued up that I think you'll love.